This podcast is brought to you through support from our partner, the Kalliopeia Foundation. The Kalliopeia Foundation envisions a future grounded in compassion, respect, dignity, reverence for nature, and care for each other and the earth. Other programs supported by Kalliopeia include the Rocky Mountain Seed Alliance and Lead to Life. To learn more about Kalliopeia's mission, visit kalliopeia.org.
Welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young.
But it's this sense of solidarity between environmental defenders and indigenous rights defenders keeps this thing going.
Today we are speaking with Subhankar Banerjee. Subhankar is an Indian-born American photographer, writer, activist, and environmental humanities scholar. He has been a leading voice on issues of Arctic conservation, indigenous human rights, resource wars, and climate change. He has done work in the America's Southwest that addresses desert ecology and forest deaths from climate change, and recently started a project to address climate change impact and politics of ecology in the coastal temperate rainforest in the Pacific Northwest. His research focuses on the intersection of art, eco-cultural activism, and environmental humanities. Subhankar's photographs, writing, and lectures have reached millions of people around the world. Oh my goodness, Subhankar, thank you so much for joining us today and for working tirelessly to bring voices from the Arctic to the forefront of our minds.
Thank you, Aina, for having me on the program. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. Well, I'd love to begin this interview by sharing the words of your friend and collaborator, Gwich'in activist Sarah James. Quote, "We are the ones who have everything to lose. We are the caribou people. Caribou are not just what we eat. They are who we are. They are in our stories and songs and whole way we see the world. Caribou are our life. Without caribou, we wouldn't exist," end quote. The threats to the Arctic and all of its inhabitants are facing just reveal why we cannot solely allow the story of place to be defined by development. And I hope today's conversation will reveal how the Arctic holds a multitude of stories beyond the expansion of petro-capitalism. So often it seems that the Arctic becomes relegated in the minds of many as a vast and desolate expanse of ice. It is terrain that most of us are unfamiliar with. However, back in the early 2000s, you spent 14 months journeying in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and have since tirelessly advocated for its protection. Contrary to popular and political depictions of the Arctic, it is actually a place robust with life. So can you share with us how the Arctic is one of the most connected and diverse lands on Earth?
I think you really framed it well, because the Arctic is, even when it is not with a political agenda, is thought of by people who live in the lower latitudes as the far north, which comes with the idea that it's remote, it's disconnected from our daily lives, we are not impacting it, it is not going to impact us, so why shall we care? So this is in the apolitical sense. And then the proponents of petro-capitalism, and you use really the correct term, would depict the Arctic in various forms, including using aesthetic frames as barren wasteland, frozen wasteland. And these are not just arbitrary things I'm saying. These are actually exact statements made by United States senators and cabinet members, a flat white nothingness, Gail Norton, former Interior Secretary, said. So one of the things that as I began to engage with Alaska's Arctic and my indigenous friends who are now very close collaborators truly became my teachers. So it was the land, the animals, and the people who became my teacher. And today I kind of proudly say the Arctic is my university. And one of the things we did was shift that perspective from the far north to the near north. And several historians have commented with regard to my work. That shift was necessary, that to then people begin to connect with, empathize with, even you don't go there. So, I mean, just to give examples, like birds go, like in early on, we were talking about that the birds go from all over the world, including my childhood city, Kolkata, India, to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And that bird is actually yellow wagtail. And there are birds that are going from New Mexico, where I now live, the snow geese, to the Arctic Refuge. And this is true for all 50 states in the US and all of the continents. So that's a connection of epic kind of a connection of global celebration. But then there are these whales that are migrating from, for example, the waters of Mexico all the way to the Alaska's Arctic. So these are connections that is going on all the time. And then there is the human connection, the indigenous people, because of this richness of life. And by the way, I should mention that not just the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, but all of Alaska's Arctic together, the land and the sea, is the most biologically diverse, as well as population wise the most significant in the entire circumpolar north, even though it occupies a very small percentage of the entire circumpolar Arctic, only roughly about 10%, but it harbors the most amount of animals and the diversity of species. It's absolutely astounding. And because of that, no surprise that indigenous people have lived there and built not only material dependency like relying on food, but cultural and spiritual dependency. So that quote that you started with, Sarah James, who is one of my teachers and a world-renowned activist, captures it. Like I could not say any better than that, or anyone else could. That particular statement is so beautiful that captures what we call cosmology, indigenous cosmology, the human, non-human relations and dependencies and honoring both sides. So what then we do with this kind of indigenous cosmology is build a frame of politics, and it's kind of in academic parlance it's called cosmopolitics, but then it leads to what I have been framing as multi-species justice, where the concerns for the human and the non-human are deeply entangled, and it is right now threatened by petro-capitalism, threatened by colonialism historically and contemporary, and threatened by all sorts of things, including militarization, climate change, of course, the extinction crisis. So, but all that said, there is a lot of work going on where the conservation community and the indigenous community, the scientific community are working together to fight these threats in a very beautiful coalitional manner.
I love the term multi-species justice. It just feels so much more holistic to imagine justice for entire ecosystems connected together. And I really appreciate that and would love to. Mm-hmm.
I can mention a little bit, elaborate on that.
Please.
So, the whole climate crisis has now become a household conversation, and sadly, but rightly, is because impacts of climate change is being felt every place on Earth. So this is become our common language now. But the extinction crisis has not come to that yet, even though it is as large, if not more significant than the climate crisis. That said, so on the space of the species, there has been a significant amount of going on over the last 10, or I wouldn't say significant, some good work that has been going on over the last 10 or 15 years. And I'm talking about academic research, which we call multi-species ethnography. And that studies, relations, primarily stories, art, and this is coming from both humanities as well as social science in anthropology. And some of the big names there are anthropologists like Anna Singh, Donna Haraway, both at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Deborah Bird Rose, Tom Van Duren, both in Australia, Ursula Heiss, who is a literary studies scholar at UCLA. Many of them are friends. So multi-species ethnography is a very active field right now, and it's happening both through anthropology, but also some coming from literary studies. But what I began to realize that even though there is an intention, there is really no frame for activism yet built. So earlier this year, I wrote a piece called On Multi-Species Justice, focusing on Arctic Alaska, providing the activist frame, the grassroots frame. Like, how do we then take all this type of stuff, but actually make it a praxis rather than theory? So that's a shift we are making now to really bring in multi-species justice as a praxis. And I actually saw on your website also, you have used on your mission statement or one of the pages, the term multi-species justice. I think it's a very useful, it's a very, very powerful, very, very important, very necessary term. And then we have climate justice. But often in those discourses and those actions, species gets mentioned, but usually as a footnote and usually takes a secondary place. So what some of us are now trying to do is bring the species at the forefront as well, both human and non-human, in all of these discourse, whether it's climate crisis, the extinction crisis, and other ecological crises that we are facing.
Well, speaking of the incredible species in the Arctic refuge, I've read that it's home and the nursery to just remarkable beings. Around 200,000 porcupine caribou, 60,000 beluga whales, and millions of shorebirds. And I think of the bowhead whale, a mammal which has a lifespan around 200 years, or the caribou that participate in the longest migration of any land mammal on Earth. But the refuge is changing. As ice disappears, more polar bears are denning on shore, and the southern Beaufort population of polar bears has already declined by 40%. And while the porcupine caribou travel towards the refuge to get away from predators and graze the nutrient-rich land, their natural migration routes have already been impacted by oil pipelines. So, have you seen the livelihood of these kin change due to climate change and oil exploration in the past 10 years or so?
So there are two parts to some of the things you mentioned, and I'll correct few of the factual aspects. So the porcupine caribou herd is indeed, it's magical. Because of its migration, the Arctic refuge is rightly, by some conservationists, they call it America's Serengeti. That herd right now is numbering about 218,000 as of the last census. And they migrate, as you correctly noted, actually 1,500 miles annually, which is the longest migration of any land mammal on Earth. And their relationship with Sarah James's people, the Gwich'in people, on both sides of the US-Canada border, 15 villages, Gwich'in villages, who actually, if you look, there is a map that the Gwich'in Nation produced, the Gwich'in Steering Committee produced, which shows nearly an overlap of the Gwich'in homeland with the annual range of the porcupine caribou herd, except the coastal plain, which is the Inupiaq traditional homeland. So the Gwich'in have relied on the caribou for many millennia. They say 20,000 years. There are some archaeological evidence that go back many millennia. And it's this complex relationship which Sarah James articulated very beautifully in that statement you quoted. So now what is happening to that? So the coastal plain of the Arctic refuge is indeed what I have called in several of my recent essays and interviews is really the most significant biological nursery, definitely in the circumpolar Arctic, but it is also one of the most significant nursery in the entire world. And it's fascinating. It's a narrow coastal plain, 12 to 30 miles or so, and about 5 million acres. So it's not a humongous place, but it's enormous density of animals. So these 218,000 caribou, thousands of polar bears that are nesting there, at least 1,000. And then you have millions of birds of like some close to like 90 species depending on it for nesting, feeding, and so on, raising their young, and numerous other species that depend on that coastal plain for giving birth and raising their young and or feeding. That said, that coastal plain is right now is one of the most threatened places in North America. And it's a binational US-Canada issue. So it's not just a US issue. It's since the Trump administration came in, so just to back up maybe one step, is the campaign to create the refuge started in the early 1950s by several American conservationists, George Collins, Lowell Sumner, and later the famous Olaus Murie and his wife Mardy Murie, and others of their time. So that led to the creation of the refuge in 1960, but then 1967, oil was discovered in Prudhoe Bay, oil started flowing in 1977, and ever since Reagan came to office as the president, started pushing for oil development in the Arctic refuge, including its coastal plain. And ever since then, the Gwich'in Nation gathered, and their first Gwich'in gathering was in 1988. And ever since then, the indigenous Gwich'in people and the conservation community, as well as many Inupiaq people, both in Kaktovik as well as outside, have been working together to defend it from oil and gas. So what happened with the Trump administration coming in? They have with the support of the Trump administration, the Alaska congressional delegation and the Trump administration hijacked the budget process last fall and got drilling approved through the Tax and the Jobs Cuts Act, which was really a very dishonest process. It was not a public process, and to sneak that in was dishonest because they knew if they don't do that, any other open debate, they would lose. So they stuck it as part of the much larger Tax Act. Nevertheless, since that time, and I've been writing nearly nonstop and organizing many things that I'll mention a little bit later, perhaps. But and ever since then, they have been advancing since the Jobs Act got passed, Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, in late December. They have been working at a breakneck speed to undermine both public participation, consultation with indigenous communities, and undermining environmental laws to just get an environmental impact statement in place so that they can start leasing as early as summer of 2019, which is absolutely unthinkable for a project of this scope. It should take 3 to 5 years. But anyway, so it's a very active right now debate as you and I are speaking on the phone. My dear Gwich'in friend, he's a counselor for the Vantat Gwich'in Nation in Old Crow in the Canadian side in the Yukon, just spoke this morning at the Global Climate Summit taking place in San Francisco right now. And there are many of our Gwich'in and the Inupiaq friends like Bernadette Demientieff, who is the executive director of the Gwich'in Steering Committee this morning, and Adrian Blanchford, who is one of the key members of Defend the Sacred Alaska. They're all in San Francisco right now as we are speaking, trying to defend the Arctic Refuge, trying to defend Alaska's Arctic. So that's the politics, but I didn't mention the climate change impacts that you were asking very specifically. So as I mentioned, there are a couple of corrections I wanted to make. One was that the Porcupine Caribou herd has not been impacted by any pipeline because there is no industrial development that has happened in its territory, in its entire winter, summer, spring, full life cycle range. They are protected, and that's why we are fighting so hard to protect their range. So no development infrastructure exists today in their range. So that's the correction. With regard to climate change, this is kind of more nerdy science, but I'll mention it, is Fran Maurer, who was the main biologist for studying the Porcupine Caribou herd for more than 2 decades. He was the federal biologist working at the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge office in Fairbanks, Alaska, retired in 2002. he, in an interview with me, in an article I published in Tom Dispatch of Nation Institute last November, explained to me during my visit to his home last October, is that the porcupine caribou herd is able to and has been able to very effectively use the entire coastal plain that stretches across the Alaskan part in the Arctic on the Canadian side very effectively as climate change as well as the variations that came from the El Nino and La Nina cycle. And because of this, they have calved here or there. Their numbers actually have increased. So they haven't been affected that much because they have this vast area to calve and nurse. And that's why what the point that Fran Maurer makes is that entire coastal plain needs to remain free of development if this herd is to thrive. So while climate change has already had very, very dire impacts on many of the caribou herds of the circumpolar north, actually most of them, some herds are actually thriving. And porcupine herd is one of those. And one of the reasons is that there is no development or impact, even though, and they are of course struggling with climate change like every other herd, but they have been able to survive through that because of this vast area they have available to calve. So that's why we are fighting. So that's an example. And you are very correct in saying that the polar bear population of the southern Beaufort Sea has been impacted very heavily between 2001 when I started and 2010, 40% decline in population, which would be considered as a mass die-off. And that is directly linked to climate change because of their primary habitat, which is sea ice, is melting very, very rapidly and disappearing. So they are becoming more and more dependent on the coastal plain for calving, for denning. So onshore dens, and there are scientific studies done on this as well. So onshore denning becomes very important. And right now the Trump administration is planning, already the Bureau of Land Management released a draft plan where they're planning to do seismic exploration as early as this coming winter, where they plan to do exploration on every square inch of the coastal plain, which is absolutely unthinkable. And it's something we are going to fight very hard. But nevertheless, it will have direct impact on the denning polar bears in a very significant way, because seismic exploration is a very heavy activity. So these are, yes, climate change is already having, and I have a lot of work done on that as well, and have witnessed on the animal populations as well as on the human populations. I wrote a very long piece called In the Warming Arctic Seas for World Policy Journal, where I enumerated a lot of the climate change impacts. But that said, because of that climate crisis and because of the extinction crisis and die-off, not just extinction, like the polar bear die-off, we need to protect places where animals give birth. And what more important place to protect than the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, coastal plain, which is one of the world's most remarkable nursery.
Quick shout out to our Patreon family. We are so grateful for your continued support. If you're not yet a patron, head over to www.patreon.com/forthewild to engage directly with our team, weekly guests, to hear additional content, and receive access to other bonus material throughout the year.
Estimates on how many barrels of oil the Arctic holds fluctuate depending on who you're talking to. One respected petroleum geologist, Jean Larrey, estimated that there are approximately 50 billion barrels of oil and 1,000 trillion cubic feet of gas. So when we put those numbers in context with world oil consumption, the Arctic may contain anywhere from 1 to 3 years worth of oil and 7 to 27 years worth of gas. However, only 25 to 35% of that amount is typically recoverable. So how can any of us possibly justify the risks imposed onto the Arctic for maybe a 4-month supply of recoverable oil and a 2-year supply of gas? I mean, how is this being justified?
So your numbers are generally correct, but it doesn't quite work out that way. So the way it works is that, let's say they start drilling and this pumping whatever 1 million barrels a day or something like that, is that process goes on for 30, 40, 50 years. So what that means, so it isn't that they'll dig it all up in 4 months and that's that. It doesn't work that way. So what that means is that what we are trying to fight is an infrastructure project of this scale to support this late age petro-capitalism is very dangerous, because the National Academy of Sciences in the US calls the Arctic an integrator of our planet climate systems, which is both atmospheric as well as oceanic. Unlike most of the other regions of the Earth, the Arctic, because of its physical geography and the ice and everything else, it actually controls the planet's climate systems. And I'm not going to go into the details of the science right now, but given that is the case, that it really is what different kind of controls our Earth's climate systems, and the fact that it is the harbinger of climate change, and where the first impacts of climate change we have observed already, and the region is warming anywhere between 2 to 4 times the global average. So if you combine all that, further changes in the Arctic affects not just the Arctic but the whole Earth. So in this late stage of climate crisis, how can you allow more and more oil and gas to be dug up from the Arctic is really a large ethical issue, in addition to the species issue, that it is a very significant issue with regard to the climate crisis, because the Arctic controls our Earth's climate, and the Arctic is warming at more than any other region on the planet. So all that combined, but nevertheless, the state of Alaska, emboldened by whose economy in significant part continues to be largely fossil fuel driven, even though there is very good significant debate going on in Alaska right now, very good people on all sides to think about taking Alaska beyond fossil fuels. It has to happen sooner or later anyway, and that debate is happening right now. And a lot of Alaskans, that's why, are opposed to drilling across Alaska's Arctic, or the expansion of drilling across Alaska's Arctic. So that is sort of the climate element. But that said, it's the Arctic Refuge, but there are other parts of the Alaska's Arctic, which, the Arctic Voices book you mentioned, does detail. It's like the Tashapuk Lake wetland, which is in the central Arctic, the largest wetland complex in the entire Arctic. And the Inupiaq people of Nuiqsut depend on its ecology, the animal life, as well as people of Barrow and other places along the coast. And then you have the entire Western Arctic, which has the Western Arctic caribou herd, which actually is 230,000 animals, and 40 communities from 3 different indigenous tribes depend on that herd. And then there is the entire coastal thing, which is extremely rich in animals, and the Trump administration is pushing forward to open up both of the seas, the Beaufort Sea and the Chukchi Sea. So to bring that back up and summarize that, yes, that's what the Trump administration is doing, but they are not getting all of these things done without challenged. And most of it, if all goes well for us, will be able to derail and stop. And how is that? So since the Trump administration announced their plans, starting going back to fall of last year, not just the Arctic Refuge, but also the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, as well as the seas, I convened with assistance from large number of colleagues, both at my University of New Mexico, as well as in Alaska, a symposium called The Last Oil, a multi-species justice symposium on Arctic Alaska and beyond. And that symposium took place in February, where we had about 30 indigenous artists, activists, scholars, as well as writers, conservationists, scientists, and attorneys came together. It was the first national convening to address Trump administration's Arctic policy and also to bring climate change impacts and indigenous rights issues in Alaska into conversation with similar issues in New Mexico and across the West. So that symposium took place, following which one of the symposium speakers co-wrote and co-organized a letter campaign called Scholars for Defending the Arctic Refuge, which was very soon thereafter was endorsed by 500 scholars from 20 countries and 40 academic disciplines endorsed the letter, which then on June 15th, the letter we formally submitted as part of the environmental impact statement process on June 19th. So that took place. And this week, actually, I'm publishing a book called The Last Oil Students Respond, a 222-page book, which will be all free and available online, the entire publication, where basically how that symposium affected our students and what did they think of it. So, and now there is a very large binational coalition. As I said, both the US and the Canadian side are fighting every part of the Trump administration Arctic policy by using grassroots action. Like I mentioned, my friends are indigenous friends are in San Francisco right now with the Global Climate Summit, by grassroots action, by taking actually large part of the fight will be legal, but I can't quite speak on that yet. Some of that is sensitive information, but there will be legal battles inevitably just because of the way the Trump administration is approaching this whole thing. And then there will be educational campaign, which is where I come in. I provide a lot of the national frame for educating the public so that the public gets involved. But there is an enormous amount of work going on, and that's why for the while that all what you folks do and do so well with your both your projects, research projects, which I looked at online, as well as podcasts like this, is to inform and educate the public about the threats. And just one last factoid I'll give, and then I'll stop this thread, is Yale publishes something called the Yale Climate Opinion 2018, which was published just last month. And it shows, among many other categories, that 63% of the American public are opposed to drilling in the Arctic Refuge. So it's a national issue, but the Trump administration has been ignoring the public completely and the participation, or I wouldn't say completely, but basically most of it. They're just undermining the public process. So that's where we will challenge them, and that's where a lot of the fight will come in, both at grassroots as well as legal battles.
I have so much respect for you and the Gwich'in and all the other people that are fighting for the protection of the refuge. It is so important on a multi-species justice level, on a global climate change level. There's just so much there. And I want to actually go a little deeper into the climate change issues and also ice. For instance, since the 1980s, the area covered by Arctic sea ice in the summer has shrunk by 40%. Then we have the albedo effect due to the loss of white surfaces like ice and snow is already responsible for about 25% of global warming. And then there's this whole issue around permafrost and how permafrost, which traps huge amounts of carbon, is already thawing across Alaska, Canada, and Siberia. But we hear less about the Arctic's offshore permafrost, which happens to be incredibly rich in methane. So what are the possible threats to our global community, say if those offshore layers begin releasing carbon, and some of the issues I'd mentioned about the ice?
This is the most important subject as well. So on that subject, I'll highlight a couple of things. So one of my dearest colleagues and friend, Professor Peter Wadhams. Peter is the person who was a professor at University of Cambridge for nearly 50 years. He retired in 2016. And the scientist who has continuously studied the polar sea ice, largely the Arctic sea ice, but also Antarctic, for continuously for more than 45 years. So his book called Farewell to Ice came out in 2016 by Oxford University Press. And I had the great privilege, because I was at University of Cambridge before coming to University of New Mexico, I had the great privilege to review the entire manuscript and provide feedback. That book is a key document, along with another that has been published by Princeton University Press last year. The title is skipping my mind, by the very eminent scientists at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, that provide great depth and detail on what is happening to the Arctic sea ice and its global impacts. So there was actually a very significant political moment that took place with regard to offshore methane that you're talking about. Is Peter Wadhams and his two colleagues, another person also at Cambridge and the third colleague was in Amsterdam. They published a paper in the prestigious peer-reviewed journal Nature by highlighting, this was 2013, by highlighting the impact of offshore methane that is already getting released in the East Siberian Arctic shelf, which they at the time claimed would have extreme impact if what they call the methane pulse plays out the way it seems to be happening, and will have on an average, they said, an economic impact on the global economy in the order of 60 trillion on an average, but 240 trillion. I mean, these numbers are, of course, incomprehensible. But nevertheless, when that major article came out, both the New York Times and Washington's Post just squashed it. One of them called it, one of those newspapers headlined it, Methane Mischief. So Peter Wadhams went ahead and wrote a rebuff, which fortunately was published in Washington Post. So our national media has been doing great disservice, including both of those newspapers, New York Times and the Washington Post. But nevertheless, it's a great threat. Since that time, we have also come to know that offshore seabed methane is getting released in other parts as well, off of the Norwegian Arctic as well, in the Laptev Sea. So that's a very, very dangerous, catastrophic thing that's potentially catastrophic that is taking place, the offshore methane getting released, because there is huge amount there. And that happens on the shallow beds, because the shallow bed, the water column becomes warm, the methane melts, and this huge amount of trapped methane comes out. Onshore methane, and I made a very important photograph, and I'm not tooting my own horn, I mean the photograph itself is in the Arctic refuge coastal plain. The permafrost is melting very significantly, and because of that, obviously the methane is coming out, even though I'm not seeing it, nobody else is seeing that. So in 2006, I made a photograph of, is a ghastly image where the permafrost melted away completely around a buried coffin. So the coffin came to the surface, and presumably a grizzly bear broke open the coffin and scattered the human remains. But what the significance of that image was, it connected 19th century, because my Inupiaq friend Robert Thompson speculated that that is not the coffin of an Inupiaq. Inupiaq would not put a coffin like that. So it's likely from a 19th century whaler. So the image immediately connected the petro rush or the oil rush of the 19th century, which was whale oil, with the petro rush of the 21st century and the late 20th century. And climate change is the connector. So it's a very disturbing image. So yes, that is all happening. And I have a lot of other climate change impacts in the refuge, as well as across Alaska's Arctic. And much of it has to do with combination of both melting of the permafrost, which we have already documented, as well as melting of the glacier ice, extreme melting of the sea ice, of course, which is having impact on every ice-dependent species out there, and very severe impact on the coastal communities, because coastal regions are getting just washed out big time. And these, some of it is, of course, gotten national attention, like places like Kivalina, Shishmaref, and other places which have to be evacuated. But in the Arctic Refuge coastal plain, where Robert and I camped, 400 feet of that land is already gone. And none of that has gotten any national media attention. And I have documented some of that in that World Policy Journal essay I wrote in 2015. So yes, climate change is very significant, but its impacts do not stay in the Arctic. It affects the entire Earth. So we experienced last year the Harvey, Maria, Irma, and this year Florence. Fortunately, Florence became from a hurricane or becoming from a hurricane to a storm. These things are having enormous impact, particularly on poor and marginalized communities and communities of color. Very, very severe, heartbreaking impacts. And Arctic is playing one of the biggest roles in that. So we need to think about the Arctic not just as a remote place, but whatever is happening up there is affecting people in Puerto Rico, people in the Far East Asia, and everywhere else.
I've actually been in Alaska for the last 2.5 months this summer, working on campaigns mainly in Southeast, and then went up to Valdez and Cordova, Anchorage, the Kenai Peninsula, and have been speaking with people around mining issues, old growth logging, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. And it's just been honestly really mind-blowing to learn about the oil economy that has been Alaska for the past, at least 50, 60 years. And that really, it always comes back to economy, because it has been an oil economy. That's how Alaska has made its money, and how so many of its roads have been built, and schools have been built, and so on and so forth. But it's interesting, just to think about how the U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates that, for instance, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline will be shut down by 2026. And then meanwhile, the company plans to close all but 4 pumping stations, seeing as oil flow peaked 24 years ago. And, procedure for the pipeline's ultimate removal is continuously updated, as Alaska law actually requires pipelines to be removed after oil extraction is complete. So we have this whole issue with the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, and not to mention the oil spills in Prudhoe Bay, the huge Exxon Valdez spill that we did an incredible interview with Dune Lankard about, and we actually spent 10 days with him on the Copper River Delta learning even more about that. And so this is kind of a long thought out question, but so on one hand, I'm thinking about this oil economy and the destruction it's wrought, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the fact that there isn't a lot of oil being pumped out. That's partially, I think, why the Arctic has had so much pressure to find more oil in the Arctic to almost replace what Prudhoe Bay is, how Prudhoe Bay is shrinking. And so then it goes, okay, well, if we don't, this is where my mind goes, okay, well, if we're trying to support Alaska and moving away from an oil and gas industry, what's next? And then I think about how you've written that what initially led you to the Arctic was an experience you had in Canada, where you went to photograph the polar bears. But then upon your arrival in Manitoba, you were overwhelmed by the magnitude and mentality of tourists. And so I'm curious about what your thoughts are on the status of wildlife tourism, especially in the Arctic region, a place where so many are flocking to say goodbye, but without any recognition that in doing so, they're contributing to its demise by prioritizing the consumption of experience above all else. Will the development of tourism as an economic replacement for the oil industry in places like Alaska create a different set of problems, seeing as both industries are rooted in exploitation? And, if anything comes to mind, is what is an economic solution that actually could support this region rather than just taking?
Yeah, so Alaska, you packed some incredibly important things in your remarks, and very, very good, very, very correct. And by the way, Dune Lankard is another dear friend, Carol Hoover, who is the executive director of the Eyak Preservation Council, another very close friend.
Oh, I love Carol.
Yeah, and Carol is a big defender of the Arctic Refuge. Carol and I did created a very major ad that was published in the New York Times, Washington Post, and USA Today back in 2005. So you packed a lot in there, and I'll mention a couple of things. So one thing is that as far as the state of Alaska goes and the Alaska Congressional Delegation, they're precisely looking to replace Prudhoe Bay with yet another Prudhoe Bay. In their frame of mind, that's what they want to see happen. And even though there has been a significant number of discoveries in the last few years that has taken place in the state lands, as well as part of the National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, which is federal lands, and some of that production is already ongoing. And so Trans-Alaska Pipeline throughput actually has gone up in the last couple of years. And this research is primarily done by Lois Epstein, another close colleague, who is the Arctic Program Director at the Wilderness Society. So Lois and I just co-authored a nearly 5,000-word piece with the kind of questions that you're asking. It's coming out from a publication based in Berlin at the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, the House of World Cultures. They have a publication called Technosphere. So we look at what does sort of this onrush of the technosphere look like, and its potential impacts, and how they're advancing that, and how we are fighting that. So anyway, so that is just the background as far as Alaska state goes, and the congressional delegation goes. They want to see all of Arctic Alaska turned into what we are calling in this article a reckless technosphere. But of course, we are fighting that. What is the alternate economy? So I'm trying to remember the name of the Alaska state senator who, and the only reason I remember this, the day I opened Last Oil Symposium at University of New Mexico, he gave a 15-minute passionate speech on Alaska's economy on the Alaska State Senate floor. What's the name of the senator? Again, I'm bad with name, but that's one way people could search, your viewer, listeners could search. It's the same day, which was February 21, 2018. And his speech was probably the most significant one, where he laid out how Alaska's economy will move forward. And that has nothing to do with ecotourism. So Alaska, again, he talked about largely a lot of the alternate economy, the renewable energy stuff that Alaska was. He talks about how was a pioneer in this and that and other things. Then he lays out the foundation, and some of that work is already taking place. I'm not an expert in that. Some other person could give you more details on that renewable energy sector, what is going on in Alaska. But I will mention the work of at least one dear colleague, Brian Hirsch, who is doing alternate energy economy for now nearly 20 years for rural Alaska, and actually installed the first solar panel, which is actually in my first book, a photo of which is in my first book, Seasons of Life and Land, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So Brian installed the first solar panel in Arctic Village above the Washit area back in 2001. So even though some of that effort, because of lack of economic incentive and other thing, has not expanded as rapidly as many would have liked, But that work has not gone away. That work is actually ongoing. So people like Brian Hirsch could give you a very clear picture of where things are, or the senator that I'm mentioning, whose name is skipping my mind, state senator, not the federal senator. So that's going on. With regard to your specific question about ecotourism, I, in an academic essay called Long Environmentalism, after the listening session, which came out in a book called, also available from my website, in a book called Eco-Criticism and Indigenous Studies. And in that, I had precisely critiqued what you just brought up. And that is exactly already happening on the Arctic seas with along with marine shipping. Marine tourism has become a big deal. And it's extremely destructive, extremely damaging to the Arctic ecology as it scales up. While small-scale tourism does provide economic incentives for local communities, and I'm in support of some of that, but I'm also very critical of, again, any kind of industrial-scale tourism in the Arctic, because this would be just as damaging as anything else. But it's a hard subject, right? For outsiders, easy to make one or the other decision. It's hard, but it is true. But some aspects of local economy could be arts and crafts, renewable energy, and many things Alaska has to offer with its other cultural production could provide that transition, which isn't really rooted in extractive economy. But unfortunately, Alaska's economy has been extractive, not just oil though. It goes back 200 years with the fur trapping and the entire fur industry that went on with the Russians first and then the Americans and others. And the book that I would highly recommend your listeners is by another dear colleague, Professor Maria Williams of the University of Alaska Anchorage, called Alaska Native Reader History, Culture, Politics. So it details that entire history of extractivism in Alaska. So there is no easy solution, to be very honest, but many people are working on it and trying to find a more sustainable path forward for Alaska, because oil is not going to last anyway, whether it's another 30 years or 40 years after that, it's done. So why damage just this incredible richness of life and lifeways along the way?
There is so much that you said in there. One thing that really stood out for me was the concept you coined, long environmentalism. I really resonate with that outlook that there is longevity to these battles, so to speak, and how to really stay committed and dedicated and not burn out over the long haul when we're working towards these huge environmental protections, cultural protections, and so on. And I guess I'm just wondering, what strategies do you think have contributed to the success and longevity of this multi-decade struggle for justice in the Arctic, and what new strategies must be adopted, do you see?
And in that essay, Long Environmentalism, as I point out, that the campaign to create and protect the refuge is globally the longest continuously running environmental conservation and environmental justice campaign anywhere in the world. It's going on now in its 7th or 8th decade. So it's really long. So what has sustained it? What has sustained it is really is intergenerational. So what has sustained it, because if you look at the young Gwich'in people, and in that essay I write about that intergenerational thing, that the elders took it on, then another generation came in, then another generation came in, and it's already like 3 generations working on the just campaign. And people have gotten married, like my dear friends on the Canadian Gwich'in side, Joe Tetlichi and Glenna Tetlichi. Joe is the chairman of the Porcupine Caribou Management Board. And what has sustained is, to be very honest, is deep solidarity among the indigenous and the environmental conservation defenders, environmental defenders and the indigenous rights defenders. Really deep solidarity, and it's very sincere, which is not necessarily everywhere, but in this case it is. And Alaska's campaign has a lot to teach us. Along with that, what has sustained is stories, songs, visual art, music, Because whenever you have one of these Guichin gathering, oh boy, it's like 3, 4, 5 days of 24 hours food, music, song, dance, even as we discuss politics. So even as we go to Washington, D.C. and so on. So there is a lot that the rest of the other campaigns could learn from, that there is this deep sense of solidarity that has not fractured and that has not gone away, and it is only emboldened. And that's why, a lot of the efforts that we did with the last Earth Symposium, the Scholars for the Defending the Arctic Refuge letter, my multi-species justice essay, which came out this summer, edited by another dear colleague, Macarena Gomez Baris, a very prolific, very renowned scholar. The strategy is not to burn out. And the way to not to burn out is solidarity, stories, art, food, music, gathering, all of these matters, so that we renew our resolve to keep going. Yes, for some it becomes extremely tiresome, but people like Sarah James has been doing this for 40 years, while Bernadette Demientieff has come on board within the last few years, but she's an extremely powerful voice now, and she is from the new generation, young generation. And the Defend the Sacred Alaska, which is really largely all young women, mostly indigenous, but some non-indigenous leaders who are actually providing sort of the radical edge of the fight now. So it just gets picked up along the way, which is what is so inspiring, that you would think people will burn out and that's that, but that hasn't happened yet. Individual burnouts have happened. Even I get tired a lot. Like this past almost a year now, I've been extremely tired and exhausted all the time. But it's this sense of solidarity between environmental defenders and indigenous rights defenders keeps this thing going.
Thank you for this. This has been such an incredible conversation. I can't wait to listen over to it and really sink into all of that you brought up. And I would absolutely really love to stay connected and uplift each other's work. So I will be in touch.
Please. I'm so glad.
Yeah.
To be very honest, this is the most beautiful, soulful interview I have done in a long time, because you're so connected to these issues. Because it's one thing to give an interview and blurt out a bunch of things and whatnot, but this has been a very, very meaningful interview.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we'll be in touch soon. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay, and all the best in Alaska.
Okay.
Great. Okay.
Will do. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. The music you heard today was from Sunara. I'd like to thank our podcast team, our co-producer and editor, Andrew Storrs, our co-producer and writer, Francesca Glassbell, our music coordinator, Carter Lou McElroy, our communications director, Aaron Wise, and our co-managing directors, Melanie Younger and Mara Joy. If you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter at forthewild.world and subscribe and rate us on iTunes and Spotify. All right, until next time.
I've been too long away from this wild open sky on the concrete trails that wind through the canyons dark and wide.